The next part of Chapter 1 talks about the scientific process. You probably remember learning some things in middle school about the scientific method, as you usually call it in middle school. We like to call it a process because it's a little bit more descriptive of what actually goes on in experimental science. Okay, some of this presentation will be review for you, but there will also be some new information that you haven't had before. So it's really important for you to pay attention and take notes along the way because there will be some things that you'll be tested on about this. So the scientific process, okay, involves investigating things. You probably already know that science uses evidence-based inquiry to answer questions about the world. The questions come from various observations that you make of phenomena in the natural world. One thing you haven't had a whole lot of practice with so far is actually doing inquiry. And so it is our goal here in this class to help you develop some skills that will allow you to do some inquiry-based investigations. Okay. Now, let's look at some terminology here, okay? It says science is evidence-based. That's for sure. That's very, very true. We don't just come up with crazy ideas and say, oh, this has got to be the way it is. There's actually some evidence to support our ideas. We make observations. We develop hypotheses. We predict what we think will happen as a result of treatment of that hypothesis. We test that with some experiments or some additional observations. That doesn't always require an experiment. And then we analyze the data that we collect as a result of our investigations. One thing that you need to realize is that the term theory in science means something different than it means in our everyday language. And this is where a lot of people get messed up in their thinking about what science is saying. So let's just talk about that for a minute. In our everyday language, when you have an idea about something, you say, well, that's my theory. Okay, that means it's just your idea about it. And sometimes that's just because you feel like in your gut that's got to be right. Okay, and it may or may not be right. It doesn't really make that much difference. It's not consequential. In science, however, when we say something is a theory, we've already got a lot of evidence to support it. Okay, it's a very broad statement that is supported by a large body of evidence, can generate multiple hypotheses that can be tested, and all of it goes back to that main theory. For instance, the theory of gravity. Okay, do we know that gravity keeps us from flying off into space? Yes. Are there mathematical things we can do to calculate the gravitational pull? Yes, we can. Are there various experiments that we can do? Think about, you've learned some things about Galileo's experiments, for instance, when he dropped a cannonball and a feather at the same time and they landed basically the same time. And so those kind of things. And so you can do various things with that to get some evidence. There's a lot of evidence to support the theory of gravitation, okay? But that's not just somebody's crazy idea. There was actually some investigation that could go behind it, and there's a lot of evidence to support it. Now, when you're doing science, okay, when you're trying to answer a question, you may or may not have an idea of the answer to the question, okay? And so let's just take a very simple example, and then we'll look at something a little bit more complex, okay? We're going to take a simple example that you may have encountered at least once in your past life, okay? You need a flashlight for whatever reason. You go get the flashlight out of wherever it's stored, and you turn it on, and it doesn't work. That's your observation, okay? The flashlight doesn't work. The question is, why does the flashlight not work? Now, there are a couple of reasons the flashlight might not work. Okay, there's more than two, but the main two things you're going to think about for the flashlight not working are the batteries are dead or the bulb is burned out. Okay, that is a hypothesis. My hypothesis is the batteries are dead, or my hypothesis is the bulb is burned out. Okay, that is a hypothesis. You know it's likely to be one or the other. In my house, it's usually going to be the batteries. I'm just going to tell you that right now, okay? But and that's very often the case, but that's not always true. All right. So what do you do next? You make a prediction. If my hypothesis is correct, okay, then replacing the batteries will fix the problem. If my hypothesis about the bulb is correct, then replacing the bulb will fix the problem. So our prediction is if I replace the batteries, then the flashlight will work. That is a prediction. That is not a hypothesis, okay? A hypothesis is your statement of what you think the answer is going to be. And your prediction is what you think is going to, how do you think you're going to show that, okay? And so be sure to keep that in mind when you're writing hypotheses. You may use an if-then statement, but really your if-then statement is really a prediction and not a hypothesis, okay? Just keep that in mind. So we're going to either replace the batteries or test the bulb. We'll try both of them. We'll see what happens, okay? So next step, we're going to do that, okay? So the results of this particular investigation are that the flashlight did not work, so that contradicts my hypothesis. And you please don't ever say my hypothesis was wrong. Say the evidence does not support the hypothesis, or the evidence contradicts the hypothesis, okay? Doesn't mean that you are always going to be wrong. It just means that it didn't work that particular time, and so that particular hypothesis is not supported by the evidence. Now at my house, again, it's usually going to be batteries, and I can fix a flashlight with batteries because I usually have batteries in the house. But if it's the bulb, if the batteries don't work, that's going to necessitate a trip to Walmart. Okay, and so that's why I would test the batteries first, because I usually have batteries around. I don't usually have a bulb. Okay. If you replace the bulb and it works, then the hypothesis is supported. And so when you're writing about a lab, you don't say my hypothesis was wrong, or I was wrong, or I was right. You say the evidence or the data support the hypothesis, or they do not support, or they refute the hypothesis. So let's keep that in mind as we're doing experiments through the year. Okay. Now, what did we do with our hypothesis here? What did we do with the hypothesis? We predicted what we thought would happen, and then we tested it. And that's an important clue as to what's necessary for a hypothesis. All right, I'm going to stop now and answer this question. What is the main requirement for a scientific hypothesis? What did we just talk about? What is the main requirement for a scientific hypothesis? Pause now, answer the question, and then start the video again. All right, you should have said hypotheses have to be testable, okay? They must be testable. When you have an experiment or when you have an investigation, you're going to test your hypothesis, okay? We usually use something called a controlled experiment. Now, this is where we talk about variables of various kinds. In an experimental test, you're going to manipulate one part of the system, one component, whatever the system is that you're looking at, and you're going to observe the effects of the change. The thing that you're changing is called the independent variable. That's what you're testing. So you're changing that compared to something else, okay? The measure that you get to judge the outcome of the experiment is called the dependent variable. Okay, it depends on what happens with the independent one. So let's look at this experiment over here. You have a plant, and you're going to test to see what works better for the growth of the plant. Okay, you're going to does Coke work better, or does juice work better? And you're going to compare that to just plain water. Okay. A controlled experiment compares an experimental group with a control group, okay? That keeps everything you want to, everything else is constant except the one thing that you're changing, okay? Now, I know you spend a lot of time in middle school talking about and coming up with controlled variables, and you guys are great at making lists of controlled variables, and it is very important to understand those. But when I ask you for a control in this class, I'm going to be asking you about a control group or a control experiment that you're going to compare with the experimental group, okay? So here we have our independent variable is going to be what liquid we use. The dependent variable is going to be how much or what the height of the plant is, okay? And then the controlled variables are everything that you're going to keep the same. The same type of plant, the same type of pot, the same size. They're going to measure them the same way. From the same position, you're going to give them the same amount of fluid. All of those things are going to be controlled variables. And you guys are really good at coming up with those. So I won't spend a whole lot of time talking about that. You can do various kinds of experiments controlling, okay? And you can use those to demonstrate the effect of a single variable, okay? It's really hard to test multiple variables at the same time, although it can be done. You have to take a lot of things into account, okay? So we're going to look at an experiment that was done in the real world with some mice, okay? The researchers found that mice models that didn't match their habitat had a higher predation rate than camouflage models. What does predation rate mean? That means that they're more likely to be caught by a predator than ones that matched, that were camouflaged in their area, okay? We can test hypotheses in lots of ways. In humans, right now, when they're working on the coronavirus vaccine, they're using clinical trials to test to see the effectiveness, the efficacy, and the safety of the possible vaccines, whether they work, whether they're safe, whether they have any side effects, these kind of things. And there are other kinds of observational studies that you can make as well. Okay, so let's look at our mice. We have two populations of the same species of mouse. One group lives on the beach. The other group lives inland. Okay. Now we're not going to pick up the mice and experiment on them. Our experimentation is going to be collecting data about how often they get attacked by, let's say, birds or other kinds of predators. Okay. And so your data is here. You have the beach and the light habitat when they're on the sand. Okay, how often they're going to be attacked. If they move from the beach to an area, like if they're going to be in the grassy area here, where they're not quite as don't blend in quite as much as the sand, then there were 5 attacks here. Okay, and so the ones that the percentage that got attacked were 71%. On the inland mice, if they were in their inland habitat, okay, where they're camouflaged, only 5 attacks here in the dark habitat. If you move these mice out to the beach, okay, then they were attacked 16 times, and that's 76%. Okay, and so what we're looking at is the evidence that would indicate the either supporting or refuting our original hypothesis. Let's look back at the hypothesis. Okay. Researchers found that mice models that did not match their habitat had higher predation rates than the camouflage models. Is that true? Is that what happened? Yes, we're supporting our hypothesis with these kinds of numbers of attacks on our non-camouflage models. So yes, they were more likely to be attacked if they did not match their habitat. All right, here's another question. In some studies, researchers try to match factors such as sex, age, and general health for subjects in the control and experimental groups. What is this experimental design trying to do? So stop here, answer this question, and then start the video again. All right. We can test hypotheses with various kinds of data, and one way we can test is with observational data. Okay, and so the theme that's used in your textbook is the red panda. Here's a red panda. Okay, and so back in the 1800s, when people were trying to classify different animals as into just the species and what they were related to, okay, they looked at the red pandas and they said, you know what, they look an awful lot like raccoons. We think they're probably more closely related to raccoons. Now, they were called a red panda because they ate bamboo like pandas do, and they live in the same general area. And so they're like, well, they kind of have some similarities. Look at those eyes there; they're kind of similar, okay. But this looks so much like a raccoon. We're going to say that they're more closely related to raccoons. Later on, as we observed them more and saw that their diet and habitat were more like the giant panda, okay, then when you compare the DNA, then you put then they said, well, maybe they should be a panda with the giant panda because they are more similar in that way. Their teeth are similar and so forth. Recent studies comparing DNA sequences actually led scientists to classify red pandas as the only living species of their own family. They're related to, they have a more recent common ancestor with the giant panda than with the raccoon, but they actually are on their own branch on the family tree. All right, here's another question. Why are comparisons of DNA sequences considered observational data and not experimental? So think about that for a minute, answer the question, and then start the video. One big thing to realize about science is that it's important that you be able to repeat your steps. You need to write up your experiments so that other people can do the same thing and see if they get the same results. So it's repetitive. It's non-linear, because if you get to one point and you say, no, that's not going to work, you can go back and start over. You don't have to start from the beginning again. You can go back and start at a later point. Okay. There are 3 spheres here in this diagram that influence forming and testing hypotheses. Okay. Exploration and discovery, analysis and feedback from the scientific community, and the scientific societal benefits and outcomes. So we want to be able to look at all of those things and see how they're related to our understanding of the world. One more question. Why is hypothesis testing at the center of the process of science? One last little bit here about technology. A lot of the scientific exploration and investigation these days involves technology. Okay, and so sometimes we think the technology is to use, is the science basically, but the big thing is that we use technology as a tool to apply the scientific knowledge for some specific purpose. Okay, there's a lot of interdependence between science and technology. And we get technological advances from scientific research, and then the research benefits from those new technologies, and so they all fit hand in hand together. And that's the end of this lesson.